In March 1942, a Royal Navy cutter slipped quietly through the freezing waters off Norway's Lofoten Islands. On board were 18 men from No. 12 Commando, handpicked, highly trained, and bound for a mission that didn't officially exist. Their orders were clear: sabotage German radar installations along the coast and disappear before dawn. But within 48 hours, the team would vanish entirely, leaving behind only fragments of their gear, a burned-out boat, and decades of unanswered questions. The operation was known in whispers as Claymore 2, a follow-up to the earlier and successful Operation Claymore that had struck the same coastline in 1941. The British Special Operations Executive, SOE, had pushed for another raid, one intended not for publicity but for silence. Intelligence suggested the Germans had rebuilt coastal radar near Narvik, equipment that could detect incoming Allied convoys. Disabling it could save thousands of lives in the North Atlantic. And so, under the cover of the midnight sun's dim glow, these men sailed into one of the most dangerous coasts in Europe. The weather was already turning. The Norwegian Sea, notorious for its shifting moods, rolled with steel-gray waves that hammered the small vessel as it hugged the fjord's rocky edge. Lieutenant Charles Jack Fenwick, 27 years old and calm beyond his years, led the detachment. His diary, recovered later from his quarters in Scotland, contained a final note: "Quiet men, quiet mission. The sea feels heavier tonight." It would be the last entry he ever wrote. Their landing point was mapped to the smallest detail, a small inlet north of Rhine, chosen for its isolation. Norwegian resistance contacts were supposed to guide them inland, but radio reports from the mainland were patchy. The Luftwaffe had increased patrols, and snowstorms made aerial reconnaissance nearly impossible. Still, the team pressed on, their green berets pulled tight, their Sten guns wrapped in oilcloth to protect from the salt air. Every step was calculated. The commandos moved through jagged rocks and freezing streams, hauling explosives in canvas bags, aware that one mistake could draw a German patrol from the nearby garrison in Bodo. As dawn approached, the wind shifted, bringing with it the distant drone of aircraft. One of the men, Corporal Evans, looked up and muttered, "If they spot us here, we're done." Fenwick's reply was simple and steady: "Then they won't." That calm, the ability to find composure amid chaos, defined these early commando operations. The men knew their odds were thin. They were not soldiers of certainty, but of precision and faith. One training manual from the period reads, "Victory comes not to those who are strongest, but to those who stay quiet under fire." The motto fit Fenwick's team perfectly. They had trained on the Scottish coast, scaling cliffs at night and practicing landings in freezing surf until their bodies went numb. But Norway was different. The landscape itself was an enemy, cold, vast, and alive with sound. Hours later, as the ship supporting their operation, a small Fairmile motor launch, waited offshore, radio contact was lost. The final transmission came through short and broken, Phase 2 commencing, entering, then static. Operators at Scapa Flow logged the cutoff, but assumed it was weather interference. It wasn't unusual for fjord operations to go silent temporarily. But when dawn came and no extraction signal flared over the horizon, a deep unease spread through the command post. By nightfall, another storm had moved in. High winds battered the coast. Visibility dropped to zero, and no further messages arrived. The following evening, the motor launch found only debris: an overturned rubber dinghy, half a crate of explosives, and a torn section of British webbing gear drifting among the rocks. The fjord was silent, the shoreline empty. Back in Britain, the mission's existence was quickly buried under operational secrecy. Officially, the men were missing in action, presumed lost at sea. Their families received standard telegrams, nothing more. For decades, no further details were released. It was as if the operation had been erased from the war entirely. Yet in quiet conversations among veterans, the name Claymore, too, lingered. Some claimed the men had reached shore and discovered something the government didn't want publicized, perhaps evidence of experimental German radar or new submarine technology. Others believed they were betrayed by double agents within the Norwegian resistance. None of these theories were proven, and all were denied. What remains undeniable is this: 18 of Britain's finest vanished into one of the world's most beautiful yet hostile landscapes, their mission classified, their fate unknown. Their story begins with courage and silence, a calm before an invisible storm. And somewhere in those cold Norwegian fjords, beneath layers of time and tide, the truth still waits to surface. By early April 1942, a low fog clung to the Norwegian coastline, shrouding the fjords in ghostly silence. The Royal Navy still had no word from Lieutenant Fenwick's men. At Scapa Flow, commanders studied radio logs, hoping for a blip of Morse code, a flare, anything. But the sea had swallowed their signals completely. What began as a calculated strike had turned into an unexplained disappearance. Number 12 Commando was one of Britain's most seasoned units, forged in the aftermath of Dunkirk and honed through raids along occupied Europe's coastlines. Their mission in Norway had been deliberately quiet, overshadowed by larger operations like Chariot and Anklet. But to those who trained them, it was clear these men were not amateurs. They were surgical in precision, common execution. That made their total disappearance even harder to accept. Major Douglas Hargreaves, who had briefed the team before departure, recalled later they knew their terrain, their fallback points, their extraction window. If they failed to report, something unnatural had intervened. And I don't mean ghosts. I mean intelligence. His words, recorded in a 1957 oral history, hinted at an uncomfortable truth. The mission may have collided with something the British weren't supposed to find. The fjords themselves posed enough danger without the enemy. German patrols moved regularly between Narvik and Tromsø, their coastal batteries armed with 88mm guns capable of shredding small boats from miles away. Even reaching shore required timing to the minute. Fenwick's orders were to move inland, destroy a small radar outpost near a fishing village called Boons, and rendezvous with a Norwegian contact codenamed Falk. The objective seemed simple. Too simple, some said. But wartime simplicity often hid deeper motives. As later SOE documents revealed, Falk was likely an alias used by multiple Norwegian operatives linked to different cells. Communication between them was chaotic, complicated by German crackdowns and constant infiltration attempts. It's entirely possible that Fenwick's unit landed at the wrong fjord, guided by outdated coordinates or false information. In a landscape where every rock looked the same and every village had been stripped of its names, even a small navigation error could spell doom. Weather, too, was a relentless adversary. Reports from the Norwegian Meteorological Institute recorded one of the harshest Arctic storms of that spring. Winds over 80 knots, waves up to 30 feet, and blinding snow. If the commandos were caught inland during that onslaught, retreating to their extraction point would have been nearly impossible. Yet survivors from neighboring fishing towns told a different story. One elderly man, interviewed in 1973, recalled hearing distant gunfire and a light that flickered red behind the mountains on the night of March 21st. Another fisherman claimed he saw a small boat burning near rain days later. Their testimonies were dismissed by Allied investigators at the time, partly out of skepticism, partly to avoid drawing attention to a classified mission. War diaries from the supporting naval crew tell of growing tension, still no sign of the shore party. Weather worsening, holding position until midnight. Radio silence maintained. The next entry is more chilling. Heard faint transmission, possible SOS, heavily distorted. Could only make out the words, "not alone." Signal faded. That would be the last record of contact. The words "not alone" still echo in military history circles, sparking debates about whether the commandos encountered a German patrol, local collaborators, or something more secretive. Whatever the case, those two words capture the essence of wartime uncertainty. How even the most disciplined could be swallowed by chaos and misdirection. Strategically, the raid's failure, or disappearance, was a lesson in the limits of control. War planners back in London noted that coastal infiltration missions relied heavily on assumption, trust, and silence. As one naval intelligence report summarized, the sea takes no sides. She hides all secrets equally. For modern viewers, the story speaks to a deeper truth about human resilience. Even in the face of total uncertainty, those men continued forward, driven by purpose, by duty, and by calm resolve. Their courage wasn't loud or heroic in the cinematic sense. It was quiet, methodical, almost meditative, a kind of stoicism forged in frost and fear. When the search was finally called off 10 days later, the Admiralty issued a terse statement. Operation concluded. Personnel unaccounted for. No public mention of the mission's name, objectives, or participants was ever made. The families received identical letters, sealed with the War Office crest and the words, "We regret to inform you." As the tides rolled back along the Norwegian coast, small fragments began to surface. A torn uniform sleeve, a ration tin, the partial remains of a British webbing pack. Each discovery raised more questions than answers. Had they been ambushed? Betrayed? Lost to the sea? The truth, if it existed, was buried beneath layers of official silence and wartime necessity. And in the villages along those icy fjords, whispers persisted, of strange lights on the water, of voices carried on the wind, and of British soldiers who came ashore one night and never left. The storm had passed, but its shadow remained. And somewhere beneath those waters, the story of what really happened to Lieutenant Fenwick's men was waiting to be told. By the end of 1945, as Europe celebrated the fall of the Third Reich, a quiet file in London remained marked classified, unresolved. It concerned the 18 men of No. 12 Commando, last seen off the coast of Norway. The war was over, but their story was not. And for a few within British intelligence, the silence surrounding their disappearance was becoming harder to explain. Declassified fragments in the decades that followed revealed an unsettling paper trail. Buried among piles of German intercepts, one message, sent from a Kriegsmarine station near Bodo, reported the capture of enemy raiders, English-speaking, believed commandos. The message was time-stamped March 22, 1942, just a day after the team vanished. Yet no follow-up report was ever found. It was as if the German records stopped mid-sentence. The possibility that the commandos had been captured raised more questions than it answered. Normally, the Germans recorded prisoner details meticulously, even for covert units. The Geneva Convention required it, and the Nazis, keen to exploit propaganda value, rarely ignored such opportunities. But no record, not even in the vast prisoner index at Dulag Luft or Stalag XXA, listed Fenwick or his men. The entries jumped from March 20th to March 25th, with an unexplained gap. Historians later called it the Blackout Week. In the 1950s, British and Norwegian investigators tried to reopen the case. Among them was Captain Henry Mordaunt, a former intelligence officer who had overseen Norwegian operations. His field notes, discovered decades later, painted a chilling picture. He wrote, "We found remnants of gear, ammunition, and radio components buried beneath a collapsed hut near Rhein. German presence confirmed, but no bodies. Locals terrified, reluctant to speak. That fear wasn't unfounded. After the war, several Norwegians were executed for collaborating with the Gestapo, particularly those who had betrayed SOE agents. It's possible that Fenwick's team was compromised by one such informant, handed over to the Germans before they could complete their sabotage. Still, even that explanation fell short. The lack of physical remains or records was too complete, too deliberate. Some within the War Office speculated that the men had stumbled upon a secret far beyond radar installations. Intelligence at the time indicated that German engineers were experimenting with advanced radio wave systems in the north, early prototypes for submarine detection and radar deception. If the British commandos discovered such technology, they might have been silenced to protect it, by either side. This theory gained traction in the 1970s when Norwegian divers found fragments of a metallic array embedded in rock near the supposed target site. The design didn't match any known Allied or German equipment from 1942. The Ministry of Defense declined to comment, citing ongoing research. For historians, it added another layer to an already tangled mystery. The human element of the story, however, remained the most haunting. Fenwick's fiancée, Margaret Collins, kept his last letter until her death in 1986. In it, he wrote, "If we make it back, I'll bring you a piece of the midnight sun." The letter, light-hearted on the surface, carried the calm fatalism common among wartime commandos, men who operated on the thin edge between life and disappearance. In one archived interview, Sergeant Tom Rees, who trained alongside Fenwick, reflected, "Jack always said he wasn't afraid of dying. What frightened him was being forgotten." His words echo the deeper tragedy of covert warfare, anonymity. These men fought in missions that could never be celebrated, their bravery filed away under code names and erased maps. For modern audiences, their disappearance stands as a stark reminder of the fog that cloaks all intelligence work. Even the most disciplined operations are built on uncertainty, trusting data that can change overnight, depending on a weather pattern or a single human decision. The war taught that truth often drowned in the same waters where men vanished. By 1952, the British government quietly closed the file. Official conclusion, presumed captured and executed. No further action required. Yet, no execution sites were ever found. No witnesses ever came forward. It was as if the 18 commandos had been erased from both sides of the war. And so the mystery endured, half written in British ink, half lost to German ashes. Their names, though absent from major memorials, survived in whispers among old soldiers and fishermen who still swore they'd seen a flicker of fire behind the fjords that spring. As decades passed and history moved on, the question remained: if the Germans didn't kill them and the sea didn't take them, then who or what did? The answer, if it existed, lay hidden in the post-war archives of both nations. Files sealed by silence, inked with words long faded. And beneath them all, one name stamped in red: Claymore 2, never to be disclosed. In the summer of 1965, more than 2 decades after Lieutenant Fenwick's disappearance, the Norwegian fishing village of Tyne stirred with quiet curiosity. A local fisherman, Arne Halvorsen, had been dredging near an old cove when his nets caught something heavy. Expecting a piece of driftwood or a rusted anchor, he hauled it up and froze. Tangled in seaweed was a corroded Sten submachine gun, its serial number barely legible beneath years of salt corrosion. Nearby lay a single British dog tag stamped C.J. Fenwick. 202,344. Word spread quickly. Within a week, Royal Navy liaisons arrived under the pretense of joint maritime cooperation, but locals soon realized this was no routine retrieval. The find reopened an old wound, one that official records had long sealed shut. Reporters were turned away, and the recovered items quietly flown to Britain. Yet by then, whispers had already reached veteran circles and the press in Oslo. The British government's response was muted. When pressed by Norwegian authorities, a terse statement came from the Ministry of Defense: historical artifacts recovered. No new information relevant to wartime operations. It was a masterclass in bureaucratic evasion. But beneath the politeness, something darker simmered, because now there was physical proof that Fenwick's team had made landfall after all. Former SOE officer Henry Mordaunt, now retired, was one of the few who dared to comment. He wrote in a private letter to a historian: if they found Fenwick's weapon where they say they did, then the landing site was 20 miles south of their target. Either the sea drove them off course, or someone gave them the wrong coordinates. His theory rekindled suspicion of betrayal, possibly from within the Norwegian resistance itself. To understand that fear, one must recall how deeply German intelligence had penetrated occupied Norway. By 1942, the Gestapo maintained informants in every major port. They knew when Allied aircraft flew overhead, when submarines surfaced, even when strange new faces appeared in villages. In some cases, these spies weren't ideologues but desperate locals trading secrets for food or protection. If one of those informants had intercepted Fenwick's contact Falk, the commandos could have been walking straight into a trap. In the following months, small fragments continued to emerge. A rusted compass casing, several British-made 9mm rounds, and a torn piece of waterproof canvas, consistent with Royal Navy issue. Each find brought a flicker of hope, quickly smothered by silence. For the families of the missing men, the discovery reopened grief that had never fully healed. Newspapers in Britain briefly covered the story before it vanished again beneath Cold War headlines. One journalist, Arthur Blake of the Scotsman, traveled to Norway in 1966 to pursue the case. His unpublished notes, found decades later, reveal encounters with both locals and British officials. The Norwegians were wary, he wrote. Some hinted at a German facility still hidden in the cliffs near Rain, sealed by rock slides after the war. Others told me to leave before nightfall. He did leave, but not before noting that the fjord waters were unusually clear that summer, and that something metallic gleamed beneath the waves. For many Norwegians, the incident symbolized the moral complexities of the occupation. Who could be trusted when survival meant compromise? One villager, interviewed years later, said, "We did what we had to, but some things were buried with the snow." His words carried both guilt and warning, a recognition that even truth has layers, and that the past, when disturbed, rarely stays quiet. From a modern lens, the 1965 discovery marked the moment when wartime mystery became living history. It wasn't just a question of missing soldiers anymore. It was a question of what governments choose to remember and what they prefer to forget. The Cold War had made secrecy an art form, and files about Claymore 2 were still sealed, even as newer generations of officers studied the lessons of special operations gone wrong. Those who examined the recovered weapon noted something peculiar. The safety mechanism had been locked in the ready position, suggesting it had been drawn in combat. But no shell casings or impact marks were found nearby. It was as if the gun had been placed there, deliberately. When Norwegian divers returned to the site years later, they found that the seabed had shifted. The gun's location was now buried under several meters of sand and stone. It would never be retrieved again. For a brief moment, it seemed that the sea had offered a clue, then taken it back. The final entry in the Royal Navy's follow-up report closed with a phrase both chilling and poetic: "Artifact secured. Site indeterminate. The sea remembers." And with that, the official search ended once more, leaving behind not just a vanished team, but expanding silence that stretched from the fjords of Norway to the filing cabinets of Whitehall. By the 1980s, Cold War tensions had cooled enough for old secrets to resurface. The British and Norwegian governments quietly reopened discussions about wartime operations in northern Norway, particularly those involving radar interference and anti-submarine research. It was in these classified circles that the mystery of Fenwick's vanished commandos gained new relevance. Because now, decades after the war, it seemed their disappearance might have intersected with a hidden chapter of technological warfare. Historians had long believed that German forces maintained only standard radar systems along Norway's coast, variants of the Freya and Würzburg models. But newly uncovered documents from the Kriegsmarine's archives suggested something different: an experimental array, codenamed Seachatten, Sea Shadow. Its purpose was to create radar interference that could conceal U-boat movements in the North Atlantic. The prototype was rumored to be operational in early 1942, near the same fjords where Fenwick's men were sent. The implications were staggering. If the British had learned of Seachatten, it would have been a priority target. The mission's radar sabotage cover could have been a smokescreen for something far more significant: capturing or destroying a technology that could shift the balance of the naval war. That also explained why the raid was so secret, why even its name, Claymore 2, never appeared in official communiques. The fewer who knew, the safer the truth. Yet secrecy comes at a cost. Among the few declassified SOE memos from 1942, one line stands out: Claymore follow-up. Compromised due to interception, intelligence breach suspected within field network. If accurate, it would mean Fenwick's team was betrayed before they even reached shore. Perhaps by a double agent in the Norwegian resistance, or perhaps by someone within British intelligence itself, an unsettling but not unprecedented idea during that chaotic period. The theory gained weight when a former Norwegian operative, under anonymity, claimed in a 1983 BBC interview that the British were not the only ones interested in German radar. He alleged that both the Soviets and neutral Swedish intelligence had eyes on the same coastline, and that conflicting operations may have collided in the darkness. It was possible, even likely, that Fenwick's men were caught between rival missions, their presence erased to avoid diplomatic embarrassment in the early days of Allied cooperation. Modern analysts studying post-war radar development notice something else curious. The first British prototype of radar ghosting, a signal deception system tested in 1943, bore striking similarities to German models known only from rumors. Some now speculate that Seachatten was indeed found, or at least studied, by British teams after the war, quietly integrated into their own research. If so, Fenwick's team might have succeeded in their mission, only for their success to be buried under decades of classified necessity. This possibility, heroism concealed by bureaucracy, is not unique in wartime history. The men of Operation Freshman, the glider-borne mission against Norway's heavy water plant in 1942, also vanished into official silence until long after the war. Like them, Fenwick's commandos may have been victims of both the enemy and their own government's need to control information. To some, this theory feels like redemption. That their disappearance wasn't in vain, that they struck a blow whose echo outlived them. But others see it differently. As historian Margaret Wells noted in her 1991 study Lost Raids of the North Sea, secrecy may protect nations, but it buries men twice, once in the sea and once in silence. In our own time, when data and disinformation define conflicts, the lessons of Claymore too feel unsettlingly modern. The balance between truth and secrecy, between calm command and chaotic consequence, still defines every covert action. Fenwick's men embody that paradox: disciplined, focused, and accepting of uncertainty. What they discovered in those fjords may never be known, but the logic of their mission remains clear: to bring clarity to chaos, even at the cost of their lives. Whether they perished in battle, were executed, or were swallowed by the sea, they carried that calm with them, the stillness of purpose that no storm could drown. When Norwegian divers returned to the site in the late 1980s, they found something that reignited debate: a section of corroded steel embedded in a cliff, engraved faintly with a German eagle and the year 1942. It was quietly removed and flown to Britain. No report ever followed. The sea had given up another fragment of truth, and once again, those in power chose to let it sink. Today, the fjords of northern Norway are serene, mirror-like waters reflecting snow-dusted cliffs, fishermen's boats drifting where gunfire once echoed. But beneath those calm waves lie fragments of a story still unresolved. Divers occasionally surface with relics, fragments of webbing, a rusted compass, an unmarked crate. Each piece adds to the puzzle of Fenwick's vanished commandos, and each deepens the silence surrounding their fate. In 2012, a joint Anglo-Norwegian expedition revisited the supposed landing site near Rhine. Using sonar imaging, they mapped a section of the seabed long thought to be unremarkable. What they found stunned them: the faint outline of a small wooden vessel, approximately 50 feet long, consistent with a motor launch used to insert number 12 Commando in March 1942. The wreck was partially buried in silt, but nearby lay something stranger: several metallic cylinders arranged in a pattern resembling signal equipment, still faintly magnetic even after 70 years. Experts were cautious. Officially, the discovery was listed as World War II debris, uncertain origin. Unofficially, it reignited whispers that Operation Claymore II had intersected with German research into radar deception or electromagnetic interference. If true, it would explain the reports of strange lights and the inexplicable radio silence that preceded the team's disappearance. When a Norwegian diver was interviewed about the find, he paused before answering, "There's a heaviness down there. You feel like you're not supposed to disturb it." His words, though simple, captured something profound: the tension between curiosity and respect, between uncovering truth and letting the sea keep its secrets. Among those still seeking answers is historian Margaret Wells, whose father served in the same commando regiment. She often describes the story not as one of tragedy, but of serenity amidst chaos. "They didn't panic," she says. "They didn't flee. They followed their orders into uncertainty, and that calmness, that stillness of purpose, may be their greatest legacy." Her interpretation reframes the disappearance not as a defeat, but as a meditation on duty and impermanence. For modern listeners, the story of Fenwick's men mirrors the world we live in now, where clarity is rare and calm must be found amid confusion. Just as the commandos face storms and static, we face noise of a different kind: information overload, conflicting truths, and invisible pressures. Their courage teaches something timeless. Serenity is not the absence of fear, but the mastery of it. At a small memorial in Ariseg, Scotland, where number 12 Commando once trained, a granite plaque bears a simple inscription: "To those who went quietly into the storm." Each year, surviving veterans place a wreath of seaweed and poppies beneath it. They never mention Claymore II by name, but they all know what it means. Back in Norway, the locals of Tyne still speak softly of the British ghosts, not in superstition, but in respect. On quiet evenings, when fog curls low across the water, some claim to hear faint echoes of engines from the bay, or see flickers of light that vanish when approached. Whether imagination or memory, it keeps their story alive. As history's tides shift and archives slowly open, perhaps one day the full truth of Claymore II will surface. Until then, the mystery of the vanished commandos endures, half history, half silence, suspended between two nations and 2 centuries. They went into chaos with calm hearts, and the sea, mercifully or not, kept it secret.